Okay, good morning, everybody, or afternoon or evening. Welcome to the Taxonomic Names and Concepts Interest Groups meeting. My name is Niels Klazenga, and I've been the convener of this interest group for the last 2 years. My controls are not working. Now they are. So this session is recorded. So if you speak in this session, then you'll be recorded. So if you choose to have your camera on, it's generally not recorded. But if you then speak up, that of course it will be recorded. So we have several ways to contribute during and after this meeting. We have a collaborative note meeting, collaborative notes document in Google Docs. The link is below, and it will be shared through the chat periodically when more people come in. You can participate in the chat, you can ask questions and discuss the topics when other people are speaking. You can also speak up, so all your microphones are muted by default, but it would be good to mute them when you're not speaking. And since we've got so many people in the meeting, it might be good to use the raise hand tool, so we know that you want to say something, and give you the floor, basically. And yeah, and so we have 5 presenters or 5 presentations. So this is supposed to be an open discussion, but maybe give people, the presenters, time to get through the slides and then have the discussion afterwards. And I have to say this, finally, this meeting has a code of conduct. The link is below. You signed up to that when you registered for the meeting. So please behave yourself in the chat, otherwise we might have to remove you from the meeting or stop the chat. That's the program for the meeting. We first have the introduction, that's this, by me. Then Steve Baskov will give background on standards. Then we have Jeff Gerbracht and Cam Webb present some use cases for taxonomic names and concepts. Rich Powell and William Ulata will talk about literature references, and then Greg Whitbread will talk about taxonomic, we'll go deeper into the Taxon concept and taxonomic name usage. And then we should have plenty of time for general discussion, and at the end so that's why we give you the floor, basically. And at the end, I'll think of a conclusion. Yeah, so this is an interest group meeting, and not a workshop or anything. So and the purpose of this meeting is to especially to hear from other people that we don't hear so much about, and tell people about the work that the Taxonomic Names and Concepts interest group has been doing, mostly in the last 2 years. Also, hopefully get some more people involved, or at least remove any barriers to such involvement. That slide was not supposed to be there anymore. So the goals, well, the taxonomic Taxonomic Names and Concepts interest group has been there for a long time, and it was established in 2005, I think, and one of the first things it did is create the first edition of the Taxon Concept Schema, TCS. So it has also been involved in later in the Taxon part of Darwin Core, and also quite heavily involved in the well, there have been a lot of discussions when the RDF guide to Darwin Core was made. It has been seemingly dormant for a few years after that, but at the TDWG conference in Dunedin, we came together, organized a workshop, and yeah, at the workshop it was sort of concluded that it was time for a new edition of the Taxon Concept, or a revision of the Taxon Concept Schema. So, so at that time, the interest group woke up and started working on a review of TCS and other relevant specifications that deal with taxonomic and nomenclatural information. So, so our goal is to provide a new version of the Taxon Concept Schema that is compliant with the vocabulary maintenance specification and the standards documentation standard. So those are the two TDWG standards about how standards are maintained and documented. And provides for use and use cases by establishing a robust mechanism for exchanging biodiversity data. Can't read this. Sorry. With accurate and precise taxonomic and nomenclatural contact with long-term resolvability. So what have we done in the last 2 years? So between TDWG 2018 and TDWG 2019, we undertook a review of TCS and those other relevant specifications. So that included the Darwin Core Taxon class, also the the Taxon name and the Taxon concept parts of the TDWG LSD ontology, which are basically TCS turned into RDF, and we also looked at some other specification, in particular the Open Biodiv ontology. And so the conclusion is basically, well, the structure of these things are very different. The content is it's very similar. And so we came up with a term list, and yeah, the starts of definitions, and that's in that Google document that is listed here. It's also sitting on the front page of a GitHub repository. So we're not going to get into that today at all. So today we keep it all very high level. So we did a workshop at Biodiversity Next. I did go into the term list quite deeply. And at that stage, we fully we're convinced that we could complete for the new version of the standard or the new standard before TDWG 2020, which is now. And but you know, while we have been racing through the first year, it became more difficult afterwards, and we had some lots of discussions in the GitHub repository that got pretty undisciplined and went all over the place. And there were great discussions, and we had and there was actually stuff coming out of it, but it didn't actually lead to to us finishing the document. So at some point we stood still and started considering what we precisely want to do, and what we and how we could do that. So the first thing that we consider is that you know, TDWG standard needs to have a maintenance group. So we propose that that the taxonomic names and concept interest group become the maintenance group for TCS. And so we wrote a charter for that. That was sent to the TDWG executive in I think July, the end of July. So, and it's still with the executive and the tech. They're the conference to organize. So I don't expect much to happen there, you know, before the next conference in October. And what we also did was considered that we needed a task group to, you know, to get to the next step, to get this modern TDWG standard like Audubon Core and Darwin Core, and that's we called TCS2 task group, because there will be version 2 of TCS. We have that ready to go when the maintenance group gets approved. Oh, this is my last slides already. So I thought, you know, for the people who are new to this, I always expected people know. We always expected people know what we talk about, but we're actually not sure if people do. So I thought to give a very high-level overview, a very quick overview of TCS, so that people at least know, you know, what the main vocabularies are and what the terms are that we've been using. So, you know, so what we have is we've got taxa and we've got names and or names for taxa, and so the taxon is the thing that we want to be talking about, but the only way we can really talk about it is by the name. And the problem is that there's no one-to-one or not even a many-to-one relationship between taxon and names, but there's a many-to-many relationship, and everybody who's has made a database knows that is problematic, because you know, the same name can apply to multiple taxa, and at the same time, one taxon through the course of time, even at the sort at the same time, can go under multiple names. So what TCS did, what came up with, is the Taxon concept, and that was not new to TCS because it has been talked about before, and it mostly goes back to Walter Berenson and the Berlin model, and he called it potential taxon, and it has also been called taxonym before. It's very solid terms, and we have some people on this interest group who like to talk about these things about taxonomic name use, and Greg will talk about it a bit later. So the taxon concept in TCS is defined basically as a taxonomic name plus a description. So, and it is identified by a taxonomic name and a reference, which has the description. So, so the taxon concept provides context to the name. So a few years later, Nico Franz and Robert Peet gave a bit less operational and a bit more ontological definition of taxon concept, which is you know, taxon concept is the underlying meaning or referential extension of a scientific name as stated by a particular author in a particular publication. So because the taxon concept have this relationship with the reference, and what is many to one relationship is a taxon name and a reference, you can assume that it also has a many to one relationship with taxon. So it makes at least easier to deal with in database, but it's still incredibly hard to pin down what a taxon is. So another thing that TCS had was the taxon relationships, and TCS had a lot of relationship types that we called down to these 5 horizontal relationship that horizontal taxon relationship that you know, especially Nico has been advocating over the last 12 years. So basically, you have a subject and object, which are both taxon concept, and they have these 5 relationship types. And so basically, you can compare taxon concept in different treatments and whether they whether they're congruent or whether they're in conflict. And so this also provides a pathway to a taxon, and it has, because then you can define a taxon as a cluster of congruent taxon concepts, taxonomic name usages, and that's so every base is a database for birds. What taxa basically has done it in a big way for all the birds, and they call it deep concepts. Every base is cool. So to me, this actually they're already called deep concepts. So to me, they're not essentially different to taxon concept, but there might be, you know, an important practical purpose why they might have to be treated as different. So there you have all the all the concepts that we'll be talking about or have been talking about, and so an important thing is that while within the interest group we might have different opinions about exactly what a taxonomic name is, or what what name we should put on this taxon concept object, or what the status of this thing is, what I call taxon here, or whether it's the Holy Grail, or whether it's the Emperor's new clothes, or whether it's the same thing as a taxon concept, and or something completely different. The thing we all agree on is that this bit, that's the important bit of the standard, and so we know we know which objects we need to deal with, and we actually think that we actually like to want to advocate the use of the taxon concept, and especially also the taxon relationships, because they will help us with name matching and things like that. So that's why we think it's worth spending the time in reviewing TCS. And we think we can get a vocabulary out of this that we all agree on, even though we don't necessarily agree on the model. And so that is and how we can do that in within TDWG standard. That's what Steve is going to talk a bit about next. So are you ready to start, Steve? I'll stop sharing.
Hi, I'm Steve Vaskoff, and I'm just going to give a little bit of background about the status of TCS and what the path forward might look like for this group. So in order to understand the position that TCS is in, we have to learn a little bit about the history of standards. TDWG has really old standards that are basically ancient, and then it has the modern ones that are current. And then there's this kind of gray area in between that's called a 2005 standard. So these are considered to be current standards, but they haven't actually gone through all of the hoops that a current standard has. And so if you go to the standards page on the TDWG website, you'll see a listing. There's 4 2005 standards, and one of them is Taxon Concept Transfer Schema, or TCS. So part of the goal of this group is to basically move TCS from this category and put it up into this category here of the category of current standard. So I want to talk a little bit about what it's going to take in order to do that. So to understand what governs standards, there are basically 3 documents that control the standards process. The first document is what's known as the TDWG process, and it's found on the TDWG website under about/process. This is sort of the original modern definition of how you get a standard. So these are the bylaws of TDWG. They lay out things about what an interest group and what a task group is. And it essentially governs the creation of new standards. in 2017, there were 2 additional standards that were adopted. The standard documentation specification lays out how the formatting and presentation of standards should be, and the vocabulary maintenance specification governs how existing vocabularies are managed. So in the original process, it was all about how you got standards started, but it really didn't say anything much about how you maintained them. And that's what these 2 documents did here. So when I refer to these, I'll call this the process, the SDS, and the VMS. Those are the 3 relevant documents. So one of the issues is, how do you make a 2005 standard into a current standard? Well, there isn't any well-defined process, but there's a couple things we can probably assume. One thing is that the vocabulary maintenance specification defined a special category of interest groups known as a maintenance interest group. And essentially the job of a maintenance interest group is to maintain a vocabulary that already exists. And so one of the things that we're kind of asserting is that since TCS already exists, it needs a maintenance group, and that the existing interest group should basically be turned into the maintenance group for TCS, the 2005 standard. So when Niels talked about the interest group charter, that's essentially, or that has been submitted, that's essentially a proposal to do this, turn the existing interest group into the specific maintenance interest group for the 2005 TCS standard. The other thing that needs to happen is to bring the documentation into conformance with the standard documentation specification. So there's a few things about the human readable part of this, but the more difficult part is the machine readable part. So the SDS talks about how you should expose standards data in the form of, I guess you could say, linked data. So, so that's one of the things we have to look at. The other thing that is missing, if you look at the at what makes something a 2005 standard and not a modern standard, is that it hasn't gone through an expert and public review. So presumably, one of the things that we would do is to take the proposed new version of TCS and subject it to an expert and a public review, and then it will have jumped through all the hoops necessary to become a current standard. So what we're talking about basically is, as I said, an interest group, which is the current maintenance group, and then any interest group, including maintenance groups, can charter task groups. And so a maintenance group or interest group basically doesn't come to an end. It keeps on going indefinitely. But a task group is supposed to be a short-term group that accomplishes a job and then disappears when its job is done. So once the charter for the maintenance group is approved, then Niels said we have basically ready to go a charter for a task group, and that group's task specifically would be to draft a current standard for TCS. And so as Niels said, both of the charters have, well, the one has been submitted and the other one is more or less ready to be submitted. So what is required in terms of the vocabulary maintenance specification? Well, the VMS has a section that basically talks about vocabularies in terms of 2 layers, if you want to think of it that way. The basic layer is sometimes colloquially known as the bag of terms layer, which basically just mints an IRI, provides an English definition and a label, but doesn't go anything into what the graph or data model is. And so this is the part of the work that that is fairly complete. And Niels mentioned that there's a Google Doc that has some preliminary definitions for all of the different terms. Part of the idea in the VMS, though, is that there is also a second layer that sits on top of the bag of terms layer. and it refers to it as a vocabulary enhancement. Currently, there's not a lot of precedence for this. Darwin Core does not really have the second layer. Audubon Core doesn't have it. And so there's not a lot of clarity about exactly how this should happen. In the SDS, it mentions a form of this called a extension term list, which essentially means an ontology that sits on top of the bag of terms. And the vocabulary maintenance specification says that it is a best practice to define what the features are of these enhancements. And so a part of that is the collection of use cases, which will be talked about later here. And then the other thing is that there should be implementation before you actually create these kind of enhancements. So that's something you want to do before you submit a standard rather than after. So as I said, this idea of vocabulary enhancement is pretty vague. It could be an OWL ontology. It could be an application profile that specifies constraints about what kind of values the vocabulary terms can have. These are sort of older styles of providing constraints. Some of the newer ideas are using shapes expression to essentially say what is a legitimate graph model, or does a particular set of data conform to a certain graph model. The other thing which I'm very interested in is the using JSON LD to define essentially the linkages between objects, but because it's JSON, it's very accessible to developers who simply want to read the JSON in and use it in the software they develop. But again, we don't really have precedence for this. So how we get beyond the basic bag of terms into a graph or data model and how we express that in terms of the vocabulary itself is still sort of an open question. So I guess if anybody has questions, they could ask now, or unless Niels wants to hold them to the end.
No, Steve, you have about 10 minutes for questions about this subject. So I don't think there was any. I didn't see anything in the chat.
Well, hopefully it's so clear that nobody had any questions.
I could ask a basic question, Steve. This is Deb. I raised my hand there.
Oh, sorry. Hi, Deb.
No apologies.
I couldn't see it.
It's okay, Niels.
Oh, yeah.
It's in the top of that pile of names.
Yeah, I see it now.
Yeah, no worries. So thank you for that introduction. For some of us who are newer to this, and I think you've helped me in the past with this. Can you just a very short example of like a term and an IRI? What is an IRI? What is that?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, so the term is sort of an abstract idea of a piece of a vocabulary. So some examples would be a property. Like a property like recorded by. Another kind of term would be a class. So a class like occurrence or location or something like that. And then there's a third category of controlled vocabulary terms, which would be values, controlled values that you would use with property terms. So those are all different components that could make up a vocabulary. But an IRI is basically a globally unique way of referring to those abstract things. So an IRI takes the form of what we would typically think of as like a URL. And it starts with HTTP. And if we're doing our job properly, you could take that IRI and stick it in a web browser, and that should take you to a description about that particular term. So those are what the IRIs are. One of the things that people often don't realize is that IRIs can also be abbreviated. So when you see like DWC colon recorded by, the DWC colon actually is an abbreviation for http://rs.tadwig.org/DWC/term/. So it takes that whole first mess part of the URI and basically collapses it into an abbreviation so that we can talk about the IRI for a term without having to write out all of that mess. But if you want to dereference it, you want to put it in a web browser and see what it is, you have to have the HTTP part. Does that help?
It does. It does help. And by dereferencing, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so that means you have an IRI and you want to figure out what it means. So if you're a human, you put it in a web browser, and you can actually do this now in theory with all of our current Audubon Core and Darwin Core terms. So if you take the full IRI, copy it and paste it into a web browser, it should take you to the definition of that term. However, if you're a computer program, you can take that IRI, and instead of asking for a web page, you can ask for machine readable metadata. And this also is currently you can request XML or RDF turtle. So if you have a Python script or something like that, you can retrieve machine readable metadata that tells you the same thing that humans would learn, but in a form that is readable by a machine. So dereferencing is basically using the internet to acquire information about a term, either in a browser or through essentially like an API request that a computer program would do.
Thank you.
Thanks
Super
for
helpful.
those questions. Those are great.
Oh. And it made another question in the chat y'all can answer.
Okay, so can we get it in JSON? So yes, you can request JSON when you dereference the term. The reason I didn't bring it up is that there's a minor error in the part of the script that generates the JSON. So it's valid JSON LD, but there are certain certain parts of the term metadata that get lost, and this is basically a bug that I need to fix when I get around to it. But yeah, in theory, if you dereference a term and ask for application/JSON or application LD plus JSON, this is all computer stuff, you will get a JSON representation, and at a minimum, you'll get the class and the definition.
Any more questions for Steve? No, then we move on to the use cases. Jeff, you ready to share screen?
Yeah, I think so. Let's see. Find the right place. There we go. Everybody can hear me well?
Yes.
Good. So Cam and I were thinking of trying to come up with some use cases that are applicable and that taxonomic names or taxonomic concepts are critical or core to. We started by thinking, what are the users or the roles out there that actually deal with taxonomic names and taxonomic concepts? And we kind of put this, Cam put this graphic together that ranges all the way from the taxonomists who are doing the research and actually suggesting taxonomic groups, upper left, through publishers of those data, through taxonomic aggregators, all the way through specimen aggregators, and then all the way down on the far right to the researchers and the groups of people that are actually using these aggregated data. And every one of these groups of people, every one of these roles, I see utilizing the TCS, or the Taxonomic Concept Standard, to make their lives easier. And we're going to go through 2 examples real quick. There's examples for every one of these groups, but we don't have time to come up with all those, so we're going to restrict it to just 2. So the first one is using GBIF data to model range or relative abundance maps for a species. And I'm not picking on GBIF here. Every single aggregator, I think, would have, you could run into these same issues with. So let's say I want to use the Circus cyanus, which is a harrier. It's a hawk. There's a male on the left and the female on the right. And if I go to GBIF and I do a search for the scientific name and map it, I will see something very analogous to what you see at the bottom of this screen. So if we dive in a little deeper into these records, at the top again, here's all the occurrence records, almost 650,000 occurrence records from all data sets. The middle block here, I've pulled out 5 of the top 6 data sets just by number of occurrences, which accounts for about 2/3 of the data in GBIF. And we'll see all of those records are from Europe and Asia, with a few in Africa. And then if we go to the bottom of this list, and again, these are all for the same search for Circus cyanus, 71,000 of these occurrence records are from 10 other data sets, which actually includes one of the top 6 data sets by numbers. So you might be scratching our head, or that this researcher who's trying to put together these models might be scratching their head a little bit. Why do we see this disparity? What data should I be using for modeling a relative abundance map of this species? If you dive into the data sets a little more, all of a sudden you'll notice that the North American records are almost all from North American institutions and organizations. The European and Asian records are almost all from European data sets, but there actually is one North American data set that has a significant number of records in Europe and Asia. So it seems like it might be a regional data collection issue. So maybe I can go ahead and use all these data sets to do my relative abundance map for the species. But hopefully that person might have a little bit more taxonomic experience, and but often they won't. But they did completely miss that there is a significant taxonomic difference between these 2. And there's, unfortunately, or sometimes fortunately, 5 major global bird taxonomies out there. 4 of them apply this scientific name, Circus cyanus, to the European populations only, and a completely different species to the North American populations. But one of them actually groups both of these populations together under Circus cyanus. So if I were that researcher and took the data that I was able to retrieve just using a species name search, my relative abundance models would be rather incorrect. One, it's likely to be heavily focused on European data. So the European birds, you would see a much higher relative abundance in the results than you would with North American, which is actually not accurate as far as the real populations go. So how could we prevent this? Which is, I think, one of the core goals of this working group, is how do we get names and authorities, that thing that Niels was talking about at the very beginning, for the taxonomic concept, and relations between those taxonomic concepts defined, and how do we provide that simple congruent mapping between these recognized taxa and make sure that that is utilized throughout the biodiversity community. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cam to go through the second use case.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone. My name is Cam Webb, and I work at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. I'm going to talk about a second use case and then review the general requirements that have come up from our survey of different use cases. So I'm part of a team working towards putting together a new Flora of Alaska. And for non-botanists, a flora is a regional checklist with a review of taxonomy, but often no new taxonomic revisionary work. It usually has descriptions and keys and photos. And ours is going to be both the paper one and digital with online versions, with the online version integrating all kinds of different information, usually via names. So there've been a number of different previous floras of Alaska, dating back to Anderson in the 1940s. Haltane's, oh, sorry.
Yep.
Got to flip there. Thanks. Haltane's 1968 flora is still probably the most widely used. But there have been a lot of new taxonomic opinions since then. That's 50 plus years ago. And so we want to provide the user with some sort of crosswalk between the usages of names in different floras. In other words, we want to share the relationships between taxon concepts. So here's just an example from Erigeron, or the fleabane, pick up on the top right, which is in the Asteraceae. So I don't have the pointer, but if you look at the bottom boxes in the figure, when Haltane published his flora, he listed 3 subtaxa of Erigeron acris, subspecies Politus, Kamchaticus, and variety debilis. Now, if we just go up the column on the left there, that's ones that are in the group of subspecies Politus. And we start at the bottom and go up from Haltane. If you look carefully at those boxes, there's a name and then a sec, and we use sec to refer to the particular according to whose concept this is. If we go up from Haltane, we see that Stan Welsh used variety Kamchaticus for those same plants. Then up to Cody's Flora of the Yukon, again went back to subspecies Politus. Then FNA came along in the early 2000s and used the variety Kamchaticus for that same group of plants. And then most recently, the Pan-Arctic flora, which is the flora that we're probably going to adhere to most closely, went back to subspecies Politus. And the diagram indicates that these taxon concept relationships, a solid line is the RCC5 term, or the taxon concept relationship term of being congruent with, and the dashed line there is overlapping. I'd just like to thank Kimberly Cook for generating this graph and helping with the taxonomic detective work that's gone into it. And also Steffi Eckert-Bond, who's my co-PI on this current work. So this flip-flopping of names is not uncommon. And you can see that without some sort of usage guide to these different taxon concepts, a user could become quite confused as to what we mean by Erigeron acris subspecies Politus. Now, once we have these taxon concept relationships or alignments, we'll want to share them. At the University of Alaska Museum, we're using the Arctos database as our main specimen database. And Arctos now has the capacity to store both taxon concepts and the relationships among taxon concepts. So once there's a standard, once we come up with TCS2 and we write an importer for Arctos, it'll be fairly easy to deposit our research on these taxon concepts into the database. Next slide, please. So if we put all the different usage cases together that we've listed and that we're working on, we can identify common requirements that arise from these different use cases. And so just quickly reading through this list, a data interchange standard should enable the sharing of obviously taxon names of any rank and also broken up into their elements. So for instance, genus and species epithet will be different. We need, as we've been talking about, specific usages of names. These are normally the according to elements. Then the set of relationships between these different usages with, and a key point is that they have a source. So those statements about the relationship also have an according to. And there's an increasing number of software programs that need taxon concept alignments as input. And so whatever we come up with should also be provide a machine readable format for transferring data back and forth. A lot of information still is stored as basic synonyms, and so our standard needs to incorporate those. Accepted status should be a key part of this, where a name or a taxon concept is accepted. And then obviously the hierarchical parent-daughter relationships that form classifications. So far we've decided not to include elements of typification or circumscription that were in the original TCS1, and this is something that is currently under discussion. So these are all actually pretty much the same requirements that went into the design of TCS1. And one of the things we might discuss is whether there are any new requirements that are not on this list. So thanks for listening, and back to Niels. We can either take some questions now or add them to the session at the end.
There's nothing in the chat that you could say, Deb wrote something, maybe you can address that. So how do we publish to make this better going forward so the Taxon concept tracking relationship are automatically kept version through time?
Jeff, maybe I'll go ahead. So the publishing element, if this is a question about publishers, then for instance, PEMSoft is working on a similar vocabulary that would now allow the publication of taxon concepts straight out of their digital publications. It's the Open Biodiv on ontology. I'm not but the versioning of yeah, I'm not sure quite what you mean by the versioning of these different relationships. Each publication will have a set, obviously a different set of taxon concepts, and then the description of those taxon concepts and how they relate to each other will also have their own publication. I'm not sure there would ever be revisions of those themselves, but maybe you'd like to, maybe I haven't quite answered your question.
I can. No, and we're going all around expertise from different areas. So I would ask it this way. I'm trying to say, if I could imagine going through time and all the taxon concepts were digitally captured and semantically linked, etc., that I could have a slider and it would show me all these Venn diagrams changing through time over these taxa were here and then they were lumped or they were split, or there's 3 different viewpoints at the same time and I can see them on the slider as I go. So, but I'm seeing that as, if we do that going forward, what kind of things do we need to start doing? And is it the PEMSoft example you gave, so that these aren't after the fact? We're not going back to published publications and trying to pull out the data and mine it for all the relationships and try to figure out how to represent that. But instead, are we moving toward a place where we'll be able to tell people when they put new names into the system, the new concepts, pardon me, that going forward, as they change, we'll be able to see that, not just in a text.
Yeah, I can take a quick stab at that, I think. I think the first step there is going through exactly what we're doing today, which is setting up or refining the TCS standard. And then I think as the biodiversity community begins to recognize or to see that there are great advantages of including the according to, or really communicating about these things as concepts as opposed to scientific names, then I think the adoption will occur, and then the software tools will have to occur around that. But I think that's going to take a while. For some taxa, we're very close. In birds, there's, Niels mentioned Avibase, which certainly already has the data for the avian taxa and relationships between different concepts through time. And it's going to take a while to build that data set out, but I certainly envision exactly what you're talking about as being the outcome, or one of the outcomes of this progression, I guess you would say.
I think that's what we all do. That's why we're doing this, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the key things is that the databases that store most of these this information have the capacity to actually store taxon concepts. So Arctos is getting there. I was just hearing some discussions about Specify. So I mean, that's a big part of it. Is if you have this data, you got to put it somewhere, and it's usually just a couple of extra tables in a relational database. So it's not a really tricky thing to do, but it needs to be done.
Thank you for that. It's very exciting. And again, I also asked not only for myself, but I know there's lots of people in this room that are new to all of this world in a way, right? So they know their plants or their herbaria or their insect collection or something extremely well, but they've not really been a part of these conversations before. So that's very helpful and exciting. And now you've got more things in the chat to go back and look at.
Yeah, somebody said perhaps, or Kimberly Cook, perhaps we can get other taxonomists on board with using this kind of methodology when they publish new flora or equivalent. Absolutely. And I think that really is our goal. I think that the database structures and the tools need to be there before we can really get this adoption going. But there are, as Cam mentioned, a number of data sets out there that already are tracking taxonomic concepts. So, it's kind of getting it spread out throughout all of those roles that we showed in that first slide, and getting all of those players to recognize the importance and then begin adoption of the concept as an important concept, I guess I would say.
And I'll also just throw in, some of you have probably been to endless discussions on this. And I think Deb, you brought up the good point that most people are not going to go back and do this mapping for, the 200-300 years of concepts that exist, but having the possibility to start now as people move forward with new publications and putting in new mappings, I think that's a more realistic goal.
Well, they certainly could happen in parallel. If somebody wants to take on that past one, yes.
Not me. There's another question. Could type specimens be added as an optional extra to clarify concepts? I think that circumscription of what that concept is critical. And type specimens can certainly be part of that circumscription, and often should be. I think one of Cam's points at the end of the last slide was that TCS isn't directly addressing the circumscriptions, at least in the first round, but we certainly recognize that it's critical for somebody who's looking at a taxonomic concept identifier and trying to figure out what that is in the real world. The circumscription, including type specimens, will be critical.
Can I jump in real quick? So these questions that are being asked are the right kinds of questions to be asking. One of the problems that this kind of conversation has always had, going back all the years in TDWG, is that the gap between the people who are new to this versus the people who've been dealing with this for 30 years is, at one sense, huge, in another sense not so huge, because even the people who've been wrestling with this for 30 years are still scratching their heads in lots of ways. There's a lot of really subtle and complex issues surrounding this, and if you ever listen in on our regular calls with this group, you'll know what I'm talking about. And I guess it would take multiple TDWG sessions to really dissect all of these questions to their true core, because they all have really fundamentally important things. And we're hoping those are the kinds of questions and conversations that get addressed as we go through this process of refining the TCS standard in a modern context. But I would add one final thing to that point, and I figure since I'm the next speaker anyway, I can eat into my own time a little bit here, which is that if there's one thing the community can do, the community of taxonomists can do, just one tiny thing they can do in a change of practice that would massively make this job easier, is that whenever you cite a taxonomic name, ASBS, don't stop there. Add the sec part after it. In other words, according to whom, right? A lot of times people will put the genus and the species and the author of the species and say, there you go. Now you know what I'm talking about. No, we don't, because there are many, many, many different interpretations of what that taxon concept would mean. So if you're a taxonomist and you're publishing, or if you're any biologist and you're publishing, and you write down a scientific name in your publication, get in the habit of adding in the sense of, sensu somebody, sex somebody, some other publication. Maybe it is the original publication. Maybe you mean it in the original sense, but usually there's a later, more recent publication that defines it the way you intend to mean it. And if you could just capture that information in your publications for the going forward part, it'll be massively easier to track all this information than it has in the past. Is that a controversial thing to say, or do the other people agree with me on that?
I agree 120%.
Yeah, it always seems to me like the low-hanging fruit. It's like an easy thing for people to do and a massive improvement in data. There's lots of other things you can do that are harder to do and give us smaller increments of improved information, but that's the one lowest hanging fruit I think people can start doing.
Good point.
Do our data standards make that easy to do?
We hope so.
Okay.
So that kind of gets into what my next session, I don't know, Niels, there's more questions coming in. We've only got...
Yeah, no, I think we leave the rest of the questions for the general discussion. There's actually quite a lot, but yeah, we're on time for your...
Well, let me power through quickly the references thing, and then let Greg do the main part of it, and then we'll have whatever time's left over to discuss. So
that's right. Yeah.
I'll share my screen here. Stand by. I think I'm doing this right. All right, I assume everyone can see that okay. So what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to go through this quickly because there's not a lot of meat here. It's more just a little history and context and just to get people thinking, is that a big part of a taxon name usage or a taxon concept or all that stuff I was just talking about, the according to, the sec, the sensu, is a lot of this stuff circulates around what we're calling references. So the question is, do we need a TDWG standard for these references? And before I answer that, first let me define what I mean by what is a reference. So that's a term that basically the way I define it is any static documentation source. And I emphasize that word static. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the most common and familiar ones are publications, right? There's articles, there's books, there's chapters, there's series, there's sections, all kinds of ways that people publish information in the traditional sense. There's also plenty of unpublished documents, things like field notebooks and reports, dissertations. These all contain potentially useful information on taxa within their pages. So it's within the scope of reference. Even correspondence, you know, especially in the old days when it was on paper, but even emails could contain some nugget of information out of the brain of a taxonomist that never got into a publication that might be worth capturing and documenting so that it can be referred to in the future. Some people have suggested even specimen labels represent a potential source of reference. That gets a little out there. That's why I'm adding question marks. Versioned databases, snapshots, and record sets, like, you know, the DOIs that GBIF assigns to output data sets. Even maybe versioned websites, like the kind of thing you find on the Wayback Machine on archive.org. Maybe those can be referenceable things, but went too far. The key thing I wanted to emphasize is static. And what I mean by that is a reference should be a body of information, a container of information, a package of information, if you will, that 100 years from now still contains the same content that it did on the day it was born. So that's what I mean by static. You know, a dynamic database isn't itself a reference because tomorrow you come back and some piece of the content may be different from what it was yesterday. So that's what we mean, or at least what I mean by reference. So why should we care? Why should TDWG worry about this? Well, lots and lots and lots of biodiversity data is documented within these references. There's scientific names, there's taxonomic concepts, there's occurrence records show up in these things, observations and things. Morphological data are usually communicated amongst scientists through references of this sort. Genetic data get included in references. In fact, almost everything we care about in biodiversity informatics usually passes through one of these references at some point. So yeah, we do care, we should care. Hasn't the library community already solved this? This is the question we used to ask 20 years ago whenever this topic came up. Well, yeah, but they've solved it for the library community, which has a very different use case. Well, not a very different, but a different enough use case from our use case for what kinds of information are important to track in excruciating detail and what information they just throw away without worrying about it. So most of what our community, the biodiversity informatics community, most of what we need, we can borrow or steal or draw from those existing library-based standards. Those standards include a whole lot more stuff than we care about and a lot more stuff than we care about. And that's okay. We don't have to use those parts. But some of our needs actually, and some very critical ones it turns out, are not met by those standards. And here's just a few examples. We often need higher granularity of pointing to a reference instant than what the library community might do. For instance, the library community standard might catalog a book, but we need to point to a chapter. Or it might catalog an article, but we need to point to a specific taxon treatment inside that article or a specific set of pages. And I won't get into details why, but that kind of granularity exists. We often need very precise date interpretations that the library community does. They usually stop at whatever the stated dated publication is. But if you care about nomenclature and nomenclatural priority, there's a lot of rules embedded in our codes of nomenclature that have much more specific definitions of what dates should be important. And then sometimes we have more complex ways of representing authorships in the library community. These are just examples of kinds of things that aren't quite met by the library community. So surely TDWG has solved this by now, right? If it's so fundamental. Well, not really. We've tried. So there was something called Gutenberg Core a bunch of years ago that was kind of like in the model of Darwin Core, going to be a way of sort of creating a Darwin Core extension for literature. Never really quite finished. There were several TDWG sessions. I went back and looked through the old programs from each ones, and there was about a 10-year period where we'd met every year and had the same arguments every year and never really do anything with them. And then there was a big push in 2014, but I didn't see any products from that. There was a little talk of it in 2017. But so this conversation's been happening in TDWG for a while, but it hasn't really amounted to something we can sink our teeth into yet. The TDWG task group existed for this group for a while. As far as I can tell, it's no longer active. At least it's not on the website. GBIF uses a Darwin Core archive standard for references, which they, according to Marcus's email this morning, tells me that they do use it quite extensively. I was not familiar with this, so this is sort of the closest thing we have to a TDWG kind of standard for literature exchange. And then there's several other candidate and draft schema and tools that have existed over the years. Some don't exist anymore, some do exist and are growing. InnoTaxa, which is TaxMLit, was one of the early ones. RefBank Golden Gate was the early days of Platzi, and that led ultimately to TaxonX, which led to TaxPub, which is an active standard in use by Pensoft and others. And TL2 IPNI were some of the early standards for exchanging literature information. And then I sit on top of ZooBank and the Global Names Usage Bank. We have our own way of managing literature. So these sort of, need-based standards emerged on a case-by-case basis, but they're not really unified. So hasn't anybody even outside our group dealt with this? Yes, sort of. BHL obviously has paid a lot of attention to this. So there's a lot of work at Biodiversity Heritage Library in an effort to sort of at least define what references are in terms of titles, in terms of, instances and how in individual pages and how they categorize it. But it's not quite everything we need yet. Platzi is probably at the very bleeding cutting edge of this, along with Biodiversity Literature Repository and Treatment Bank. That consortium is working with Zenodo to mine treatments out of literature. And in doing so, they obviously need to anchor it to literature. So there's a lot of work being done in that space. That's probably the most active and interesting development part of all of this right now. NCBI also pays attention to this, has their own way of dealing with it. Wikidata has a very robust way of tracking literature instances, probably much more robust than we need, but as was put to me by Rod Page yesterday, there's probably nothing that we are talking about or thinking about that hasn't been discussed very extensively in that Wikidata environment. So obviously this Wikidata, it may not solve all of our problems, it may not be our standard, but it certainly informs how we're going to move forward with all this kind of stuff. And the other area, which is tightly linked in with that Platzi Biodiversity Library Literature Repository Treatment Bank group, are the proactive publishers. PennSoft, European Journal of Taxonomy, the MNHN journals. Those folks are really pushing the envelope, and they should be a very active part of this literature question. So what is it we're trying to solve? Why can't we just use all this stuff I just mentioned and pick one and run with it? Well, lots of biodiversity data players maintain their own internal bibliographic literature reference databases themselves with very little cross-linking going on, very little data exchange or shared identifiers. So we have all these siloed pools of literature data with our own internal identifiers that work great for our own internal purposes, but start to break down when we start to share things, especially like taxon name usages with each other. If we want to send a literature citation, what format do we send it? It's certainly a very fundamental component to these taxon name usages we're talking about in this context here, the TCS context. And increasingly taxonomy in general, not just nomenclature, is becoming anchored to literature. That's what I was trying to get at with my point that when you talk about names and taxon concepts, make sure you anchor to something, and that something is usually another usage in an earlier piece of literature. And life, of course, would be a whole lot easier if we had a simple data exchange standard optimized for the sources of reference metadata that we, the biodiversity community, need. And ideally, if we could converge on some kind of shared identifiers, maybe DOIs or the magic bullet, maybe Wikidata QXXIDs are the right way, who knows yet, but we'll find it. But if we could somehow streamline the way we share information about literature and references, I think we're going to be able to mobilize a lot of things that we've never been able to mobilize before. So where do we go from here? Well, number one, do we establish or reestablish a TDWG interest group for literature or references, or does it fold into the TCS group? That's an open question. We've discussed it and debated it in the TCS group. Maybe it falls within our purview because it's so fundamental to what we're doing, or maybe it needs a dedicated group like it used to have in the past, or maybe even just a task group within TNC, as I was saying. We definitely need to coordinate with the TDWG TNC group. So in other words, whatever group, whether it's within TNC or a separate group, there needs to be very tight coordination because that's one of the things driving the need for this. We need to coordinate with TDWG people in biodiversity data task group, people in the biodiversity data craftsman. That's the attribution group. David Shorthouse is leading that group. He's got a session on it later this tomorrow or next day, I'm not sure when. Because people are very fundamental to literature as authors, and we need to go beyond a big blob of text of here are some text string characters that somehow represent the list of authors of this publication. Probably we want to atomize the individual authors, and that's why we need to be plugged into the people in biodiversity data task group. We need to coordinate with the biodiversity publishing community, the PennSofts, the EJTs of the world. We need to make sure that whatever we do is harmonious with what they're doing, and whatever they're doing is harmonious with the standards we're trying to develop. And then ideally, we're doing all of this so we can define what the basis of record of a publication is, how granular it is, find out where on that scale that we're comfortable defining what can become an instance of a reference in our context. Obviously come up with the bag of terms that Steve was talking about that we can use that is, not too soft, not too hard, not too rich, not too lean, just the right amount that allows us to exchange the information we need at the parsed granularity we need without getting too far into the weeds like the library community does. And then if necessary, establish new terms that are particular to our biodiversity need for characterizing literature, characterizing references in such a way that we can tag them in ways that are helpful to our world. Above all, what we're really trying to do is get to a point where we can easily aggregate our existing reference content. We've all got these siloed databases. We don't necessarily have to aggregate them all in one place, but even with shared identifiers or even a shared data exchange standard, at the very least, we can know that this record in my database pointing to what I think is a publication corresponds to that record in your database corresponding to what you think is a publication. And ultimately, we obviously need to clean up our existing reference content. Unfortunately, literature citations are just begging to be entered in thousands of different ways. I think Guido Sauter, who's on this, could talk to that with RefBank, where how many different ways people have creatively represented the same bibliographic citation just by adding commas or removing commas or capitalizing words or not capitalizing words and whatnot. So if we could come up with some way of sort of collapsing all that morass of what we call the dirty bucket of citation strings into a clean bucket of actual conceptual references represented by an identifier, we'll be a lot further off. And then finally, reconcile our existing references, ideally with shared identifiers, so that we can all start throwing this information back and forth and aggregating them in ways that make it a lot more seamless to share all our information. I think that's all I had. Sorry I talked so fast, but I know we're kind of running short on time. So let me stop sharing my screen. If I can get my mouse to go where I want it to. I mean, there's probably lots of questions, but I think what I just talked about is slightly tangential to the main task group here. So maybe if there are questions, we can save them to the end session, because I'd like to make sure Greg has time to cover what he needs to cover.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. That was my idea as well. Greg, are you ready?
Am I ready? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Take it home.
Can you play this thing for me?
Ah.
Or do I have to try and do it here?
I can.
I could try, maybe.
I've got it.
Okay.
I just need to present, and then I need to share my screen.
Can I control it here?
I don't know how to do it. If you so let me.
Remote control. The button says remote control at the bottom.
Let me first share my screen.
Once you're sharing.
I'll share. So remote control, where's that?
And the ribbon of the it's part of Zoom menu.
All right.
And
Should
you
I
can
first
choose-
go to present, and
Yeah.
then
It's part of Zoom.
Yep, look up there, Niels, at the top. You should see something that says remote. It looks like a mouse.
and then I just give it to Greg.
Correct.
Yeah.
You should be all in charge, Greg.
Ah, let me see.
Take it home.
Ah, almost. No, I broke it.
So do it again.
Tap to resume.
I'll just start talking, and so if you can't do it, I'll do it for
Yeah,
you.
can you go back to the beginning? Oh, I can see that. Hang on a minute. Yep. I think I can see that. Leave it alone. I think I can do that. Okay, let's go. Sorry about that. I'm sort of working from a tablet because my computer is in a place I can't get to at the moment. So I tried it on my phone, but it was too small. So, okay, I'm going to talk about taxonomic name usage. Like, there's probably not much I have to say, really, because most people have said it all already. That's it. But let's go. So I can't change the slide. Oh, here we go. Taxonomic names and concepts. The name of the group is Taxonomic Name and Concepts Group. We're working with TCS. We're talking about, as it's pretty obvious by now, it's an interchange standard for the metadata at the intersections on the biodiversity knowledge graph, the names, taxa, and concepts. we had a few questions earlier about versioning and how does everything else relate? Well, we're all TDWG standards are using names somewhere. So, and I don't think the TCS is concerned with the profile data or the currents data. It's only how we talk about names and share this kind of content. So it's been the subject of TDWG for a long time. The very first TDWG standard is BISBE, plant names in botanical databases. Around that time, we were all working with names and concepts, and then Walter came up with his paper on potential taxa, and where we attach all of the other facts that we're dealing with in biodiversity. And of course, that thing is potential taxon, he called it. It's obtained, he said, by adding a circumscription to a reference to a name. And this is a quote, yes, does it work? It does. So we worked on this quite a lot, and then in 2005, the TCS became a TDWG standard. Standard for the interchange of nomenclatural and taxonomic metadata. Right? And definitions here, I'm not going to read all this up, but does it work? Can we move it on, Niels? I can't change it, Niels. Okay. Well, was this the next one? Okay. Well, according to Steve's definition, TCS is definitely not a bag of terms. It's a complex application schema. It's the next level up, the piece. Steve said, doesn't exist yet for Darwin Core or Audubon Core. But in our case, we've kind of started with it. But there are many, many use cases for nomenclatural and taxonomic data that just aren't satisfied with this document model. We can't use it to publish on the semantic web. Web services, that's record at a time delivery, CSV dumps, building a simple bibliography, exchanging just a bunch of names. Building the biodiversity knowledge graph. This TCS just isn't very useful when it comes to that. So it wasn't really used very much. It did get some uptake, with Roger Himes' ontology, that LSIG RDF vocabularies. But overall, people tended to fall back to Darwin Core. But, Stephen Cam in the RDF user guide for Darwin Core recommended that Darwin Core isn't used for this purpose. Not being able to change the slides, it has all that. So, even though TCS is not a bag of terms, it doesn't mean that it's not a good thing. We put an enormous amount of work in it. A lot of people worked on it. A lot of thought went into its development, and I think it's paid off enormously. It's spun off a huge number of people, working on concepts and their relationships and how the biodiversity knowledge graph works. And I think if it was recast as a simple TDWG vocabulary, as a bag of terms, if we could model it using GraphQL or JSON-LD schema, we'd probably achieve wide acceptance. It's annoying, I can't move it. Excellent, thanks. Thank you. Okay. So how do we go about doing this? How do we build a standardized, reusable vocabulary for names and concepts? Well, if we go back to Niels' last animation, The idea is that we base this on a taxonomic name usage class. This is like, you know, the fundamental component that is used to build TCS itself. And then basically it's just a name and its source and the context in which the name appears. Of course, there's, you know, properties and relationships, etc. But basically it's a very simple thing. We could regard it as a subclass of the source or reference. It is itself, you know, a kind of reference. But when we try and, if we try and model it that way, it gets a little complicated and becomes hard to interchange because we don't yet have, you know, like a reference standard. But basically, a taxonomic name usage is the fundamental citable object. You know, it's already used, you know, in many projects, we build our taxonomies out of it. It's the factual building block of all nomenclatural and taxonomic metadata. The enabling component, you know, the nodes in the biodiversity knowledge graph. We use it, as Walter says, in potential taxa as a point of attachment for all taxonomic facts. It's the endpoints in our relationship assertions as potentially the referent to the stable taxon concept for the taxon identifier that most people are demanding. But it could just be a name, you know, and if we model it this way, we only need to use the bits that we need, you know. We can just deliver a name by itself, you know, is a fundamental requirement. Next, please, Neil. So, the standards case for a taxonomic name usage, it's basically the how of where a name is used within the work. That's the usage. Rich Pyle says, I should ask Rich to read this. So, any usage or treatment of scientific name within a reference. TNUs are the foundation for all code-governed nomenclatural acts. That's important, because we can use it for our nomenclature as well. Taxon concept definitions, treatments, synonyms and classifications, and all under other forms of taxonomic assertions. So no matter how complex, you know, or simple, you know, our requirements here, you know, most of our experiments show us that all nomenclatural and working systems, you know, we have the national species list here, Zoo Bank, many people using it. All our metadata can be deconstructed to taxonomic name usages and reassembled, importantly, and without losing any information. It becomes the, you know, the perfect class for interchange of taxonomic names and concepts. You know, we're not talking, it's not, that's all we're talking about. This is how we move these things around. Last one, Niels, I think we have one more. Okay, so it's the politics are being the subject these days, you know, both here and I imagine most places around the world. You can't sort of have one of these discussions without this, what we call probably a noodle diagram. But this is just like a simple sketch, really. It's, you know, it's not really accurate, doesn't really, the lines don't really mean much, but it's basically my idea of a subtyped taxonomic name usage, which just shows you the components in the systems that we have been building and how they all map back to taxonomic name usage. It's like an illustration of how a replaced synonym, you know, becomes a taxonomic name usage and how we can sort of link to that. Importantly, the taxonomic name usage becomes the point of connection to the rest of the network, the rest of the internet. You know, how we can attach these things to anything we need. Okay, so I hope that will do. Any questions, I suppose? Well, I'll give it back to Niels and we can ask questions about it.
Does anybody have specific questions?
Something on your microphone, Niels. We don't hear you.
Yeah, I don't hear anything at all.
That should be better now. Anybody specific questions for Greg or this topic, or we are just about on time to move into the general discussion. So.
There are a number of questions in the chat.
Yeah, so can I just ask, so I think we move into the general discussion and we'll address the questions in the chat. So we still have about 25 minutes and I probably want to use the last 5 or so minutes to, you know, sort of discuss how we can work better and make it easier for people to get involved and things like that. So we have about, you know, 20 minutes to for the general discussion. So can I'm going to the chat right now. Can I just ask people who have urgent questions that I put in the chat to just unmute the microphone and you know, and put them to the group again? Is there any hands up?
See, Ian Engelbrecht put in a good question. I'm unclear on the relationship between a TNU and a taxon concept.
Should I take a stab at that?
Sure, we all
Go
could
for
go
it.
for it.
So that's one of the things we have wrestled with in a lot of our monthly meetings. The way I think of it is a TNU is a human being's implied assertion about a circumscription of organisms in nature, including the ones that human had examined, as well as the ones implied to also still be out there that the human never looked at. But the key point is the TNU is the documented information, a package of information, if you will, that tries to capture the essence of what that taxon concept was. Whereas a taxon concept is a set of actual organisms out in nature, the thing that would still be there even if no humans had ever been around. So when we talk about taxon concepts, we generally think about it as the actual set of organisms in nature. Whereas when we talk about a TNU, we're talking about the taxon treatment in the Platzi sense. A TNU is a treatment. A treatment is the package of information that comes with a TNU, that a TNU represents, and included within that package of information is a whole smattering of stuff that allows one human to talk to another human and try to refer to this abstract set of organisms that live out there in nature. I don't know. I don't think I did a very good job, but Jeff or Cam or somebody else want to take a disentangle that.
I think that was.
Could I respond?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So thanks. So the question then is, why not just call the thing that's in the wild the taxon? If we agree that that's something that exists independent of humans and the way that we perceive the world, and keep the term taxon concept for our sort of labels of how we construct those taxa for ourselves.
I think that's actually what we already do. So the taxon is the thing that's out there in the wild, and the taxon concept is, you know, what is in some person's head, but the idea that what a taxon is.
So before I shut up and turn it over to someone else, let me just say that there are kind of two angles to that. One is the semantics. In other words, what word do we use to refer to the thing out in the wild versus, you know, that notion of a taxon concept has so much baggage associated with it. I always joke that if there's 10 taxonomists in a room, there'll be 12 different definitions of what a taxon concept is. And so there's that whole semantics problem. And that's something we wrestle with a lot and we will continue to wrestle with. But then there's sort of the ideological version of it. There's this, do sets of organisms exist as natural entities in nature independent of human beings? And we're not even sure that's the answer to that is yes. I mean, that's a philosophical debate we could have over alcoholic beverages at some point. But the hard part in the informatics Tadwig context is, how do you develop a standard of information for something that exists outside of a human mind? And that's why I'm not sure, you know, if you're just saying, come up with a word that says, oh, we're talking about the organisms in nature, therefore there's no Tadwig cloud of information associated with it, versus the things that humans write about and document in references, and that's where the Tadwig cloud is. That's the sort of edge we're on, and we're talking about, we all agree there's a need, or most of us agree there's this need for a separate class of thing called the concept, which is different from the TNU, from the instances of people talking about that concept. But I'm going to shut up now and defer to Jeff or Cam or somebody else to sort of flesh that out a little more.
I would just add to that, I think that, you know, a TNU or multiple TNUs could map to a single concept, the way that Rich is defining it, whereas a TNU would only map to one concept. That makes sense. So it's a one-to-one in one direction, but it's easily a one-to-many in the opposite direction. If that may have muddied the waters more than clarified it, but.
It's one-to-many. So what it means is that each TNU implies only one concept, but one concept might be represented by many TNUs.
Right.
I'm not sure I agree with that. For me, a TNU and a concept is exactly the same thing. It's just a different word that you use and a different endpoint coming on it. So, you know, it's a TNU if you come from the data.
Yeah, and that's where our philosophical debates get wild.
You know, you know, in the taxon concept, is as you know, from the other end. So as a you know, as a taxonomist, I'm much more comfortable talking about taxon concept and taxonomic name usage. But you know, if we look at the database and taxonomic name usage, it makes much more sense. And also, you know, synonyms, I would have a problem calling taxonomic name use, you know, taxon concept, but not. So I would be much more comfortable calling them taxonomic name usages. But in principle, if you go and look at the word, then they're exactly the same thing.
So this conversation could fill up easily the rest of the time.
That's right. So I mean, we're not going to go there, but,
yeah. I mean,
well, it's interesting that this conversation on the GitHub issue went to like 20,000 words before it was closed.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah, so we might not agree, not so much on what word to use, but we can agree.
I think the important thing, Niels, is that, you know, we use TNUs every day, and you know, go back to Walter's potential taxa. Thing is that only some TNUs are concepts.
Well, yeah, that's fine. I agree with that, and I'm happy to use TNUs. I'm just not happy to have both.
Yeah, I think that from my perspective, taxonomic concept or taxon concept means different things to different people, and that's been very clear throughout many of our discussions. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're thinking TNU is more descriptive of this name according to. Because there is so much I won't say confusion around taxonomic concept, but when two people are discussing biodiversity data and they reference taxonomic concept, they often mean different things. And that's one of the things that I think this working group is struggling with as far as the naming of this goes.
Maybe then we might want to try and iron out those wrinkles first.
It would certainly facilitate future communication if we could do that. We tried that with TCS1. We actually created an online glossary of terms, a full thesaurus and synonyms and everything. And it was awesome. And it took hours to build and nobody ever looked at it. And now I can't even find it on the web anymore. So it's really a matter of getting people to agree to a vocabulary.
Yeah.
But there is another interesting aspect of this, and that's essentially taxonomic name usages cite other taxonomic name usages. And when you look at the figure Greg showed at the end, this all the different relationships, that's essentially the typing of the citation of a taxonomic name usage. So if you make a synonym, you create a new taxonomic treatment and you make a statement in it. Say, I refer to this description or this taxonomic treatment or this name, TNU, but I consider it a synonym. So you have an interesting reference system at this level too, which we have not yet really explored. And I think that's something well worth exploring, because that's in a way the basis of the catalog of life, because the catalog of life is based on statements in the literature that says, I consider this TNU now a synonym of this other one.
Well, part of that's true. I agree. And I've spent a lot of time playing with the interconnections among TNUs within the Global Names Usage Bank, which is the database behind ZooBank. And there are limits to that. And the primary limit comes back to what I said before, which is that most taxonomists aren't explicit when they write these things down. When you look at a TNU, you know they're probably referring to another TNU, but often you have to divine that from a cloud of information around it, because they don't explicitly say, I mean this name in the sense of X. And so some cases, yes, especially with heterotypic synonymies, yeah, that's an easy one. But then when you get into sort of concept mapping, that's when it breaks down, because people aren't explicit in most of the literature.
Well, that's an interesting thing too, because that means the literature is complicated, is open for interpretation. And that's in a way important to understand, because if you want to publish in the future, we should avoid that. So we should come up with a way how we publish such statements properly so machines can read them.
Exactly. And so in your language, Donat, the way that would work is convince Pensoft to always make sure that when everyone cites its taxon name in any scientific publication, they point to a Plotzi treatment or a treatment bank treatment ID. So now we know explicitly which TNU they're referring to, not just the binomial genus species name.
That would be ideal.
One way of doing it.
But it would also be important to be explicit about all these different relationships. So we say this is a synonym, or it's a new combination, or it's an augmentation, or because this typing is very relevant, because that's essentially makes the concept more complete, or this potential species in terms of Walter makes it more bigger and more complete.
I agree, and I think that's a big part of what we have in front of us moving forward with this task group.
So Rich, keeping the time in mind, is it okay we move to the next topic? I picked something up that in the chat that was from Beckett Stern, and it says, I'd be interested in discussing how we can collectively help advance the development of use cases that help move past definitional issues toward identifying shared standards for implementation. So I think
that's the question we're all asking ourselves. And
well, yeah, that's it got lots of +1s in the in the chat.
A simple way to start could be just to let's just start a document and share it, and collect as many public use cases as people can contribute.
Yeah, but how to make it easier for people to actually contribute, and we'll talk about at the end a bit about that. I thought maybe we put it, you know, a tag use case in our issue tracker, and people can just put it in there, submit it that way, and I can always add the document to the issue if they're more comfortable. If they're more comfortable writing it in a document. Well, we would like to have the more more detailed information. Also, yeah, you can always contact one of the, you know, core members of the interest group. My email address is at the front of the of our repository. So that's github.com/tedwick/tnc/ oh no, that's already there. Yeah, so maybe you can use that. So yeah, we are very interested in use cases other than than the ones we come up with ourselves, because we are only a few people. And there's a use case document in the repository. Maybe someone can find the link and put it in the chat. That has yeah, it's basically just a list, but yeah, it would be good to get a lot of them worked out the way Cam and Jeff did earlier for those two use cases they showed. I had this is about references, Rich, and it was from Kimberly Cook. Anyone familiar with the functional requirements for bibliographic records model?
Yeah, I think that was answered also later in the chat, but basically, I'm not familiar with that particular one. I have heard of it, but I haven't dissected it and looked at it. But I think it's one that fits in the library world really well, and it's like mods and some of these others that we ought to look at more closely and make sure that they might have found a new way to build a better mousetrap in some ways and derive what we can from it. But there's several others too, like JATS and National Library of Medicine, and there's others out there that play in this space. And that's one that I haven't looked at carefully, but I think should be part of the investigation if we do move in the literature direction.
Awesome. Any other subjects here?
I'd like to maybe highlight just a comment comes a little bit earlier. It's from David Shorthouse. Could you imagine a service for collections managers to assess across the whole of their transcribed specimens which ones are likely to have suffered from a slide in concepts and uneven curation? I think it's a really, really important issue. That, I mean, this in a way forms a use case. It's a complex use case. It's more than just the data communication itself. But yeah, if we could collectively come up with a service that would put a flashing red light on those names that people need to take care of, I think this would be a huge
yeah, that would be great.
Be a huge contribution of our community.
So I've been thinking about not so much individual collections, but you know, I've got a role in the Australasian Virtual Herbarium, and that you know, that's hosted by the Atlas of Living Australia, and that's for about 25 different herbaria now. So that, you know, that if there's a taxonomic revision, so that you can actually see which, yeah, that you can flag the record for which you think the, yeah, for which the determination need to be verified or changed to.
You kind of do this now, Niels. You know, with as your taxonomic name usage graph becomes more or less complete, you know, it's pretty easy to automate, you know, change in relative position of taxa.
Oh, yeah.
Like changing concepts over time,
yeah.
You know, between versions of a taxonomy. That's kind of the only one we have difficulty with, and that we have, you know, much discussion about here, is when a name changes and the concept remains the same.
Yeah, but that's only one side of the. That's only one side of the issue, you know, of the knowing what the taxonomic treatments say. But the other side is, you know, getting the taxon concepts on the determinations rather than just the nominal concept or names.
No, I'm not talking about nominal concepts. I'm talking about the changes between taxonomies.
No, but
you know,
you're talking
like
about the taxonomies, and I'm talking. That's only one side of it. The other side's the determinations, and they need to use the taxon. The determinations, identifications.
Yeah, that's
and they just have the names.
That's what we're talking about. Determinations.
No, if they just have a name on it, you can't see. You often can't see which concept they are and whether they have already been updated or.
No, but I think David's comment was about like feeding information to the curators of specimens, so they have notification of changes in names and concepts.
Yes.
You know, it's like we're not talking about automatically changing determinations, but
no, definitely
feeding information to the curators.
Definitely do not want to automate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, the important use case. So the last 4 minutes that we've got, I'd like to use for maybe discussing some ways how we can do things, how we can work better and you know, more transparent and make it very easier for people to see what we're doing and you know, and lift the barriers if there are any to you know, for people outside the core interest group to contribute.
I think it's pretty open at the moment, isn't it, Niels? It's like just as people know when the meetings are happening, they can come when they want to. Everything sits on GitHub. The issues are free, publicly available, but nothing is hidden.
No, that's right. And I try to, yeah, we try to be as open as possible. But yeah, I was thinking of, you know, we also have that Google Doc that you know, people can comment on, and there have been a lot of comments. Well, it's mostly for myself, but you know, at some point it becomes really hard to track what the comments are in a Google Doc and exactly what the state of of a Google Doc is. And what I've seen other people, other interest groups do is I actually saw it from the people in biodiversity task group that David has set up, that they have issues for every term, and then project boards for the classes, so that you can have the full discussion of the issue of a term in the GitHub issues, and then you can track on your project board whether we feel that an issue has been completed or a term has been completed. So that happy with the definition, and we have all the examples and everything. And I think that might make it a bit easier also for other people to to say something, because then you can say something about a single term, and you don't have to do it in the about the whole standard. And also, if you watch the repository, then you can see when people comment, which I get all the emails from from the Google Doc as well, but it gets very messy and very hard to track. So I thought that might be a way to make it even easier to if everybody thinks it's open enough, then so I'm happy. And then we see, but I actually had one more slide is how people could get involved, which I'm not going to share now, because there's also thing. So we will keep the Google Doc open for a while, for quite a while. We'll copy the contents of the chat in there as well. So if people have anything to comment or want to get us to contact them, and then they can put notes and can put their email addresses in there, so we can read them if you want us to get back to us. So if there are other people who want to become core members of the interest group, just send me an email and I'll add you to the list. So I will keep announcing the meetings as GitHub issues, which I haven't done for the last few ones because we're working on those charters. My institute used to have a Zoom account, and I always put a link to the meeting in the GitHub issue. But I'm now using the WebEx from Cyro, and I don't think it's probably appropriate to put the meeting link in the GitHub issue for everybody to access. So if I'll announce the meetings, and if you want to come and you're not a core member yet or not on the email list, then just send me an email and I'll add you, and you just get the invitation as well. So with that out of the way, I would like to thank all the presenters. I think did a great job presenting all the different issues or different things we have been discussing. And I would like to thank William and Holly for running this this meeting, and everybody, and for helping me monitoring the chat and putting the link to the Google Hub, the Google Doc in. So you know, and everybody who has commented or has contributed to discussion, and you know, if they showed an interest, that's all great. So with that, yeah, thanks everybody for coming.